Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
The American state of Florida has been quite in the news lately over its controversial Don't Say Gay bill that is being championed by the Republicans in that state. For listeners who may not fully appreciate what the bill is about, we don't need to get into details. What you may want to just simply know is that this is a bill that's being championed by evangelicals who stand in very vocal opposition to the gay movement. A couple weeks ago, those same evangelical Republicans were in the news for a very different and yet very related reason. A principal in a Tallahassee, Florida elementary school resigned after parents complained about a lesson given to the grade 6 class, which featured images of the famous statue Michelangelo's David. Those parents were quite offended because in their minds, this exposed sixth graders to pornography. Now, the Florence Museum that exhibits that statue issued a response saying, "To think that the David could be pornographic means truly not understanding the contents of the Bible, not understanding Western culture, and not understanding Renaissance art." In case what they're really saying is that that's just Americans being all puritanical and need to take a few lessons from the Italians, I think the Italians might want to be careful about throwing stones out of their glass houses, because let me tell you a story. It wasn't so long ago that my wife and I took a trip to Italy, and one of the things we did was tour the Vatican Museum. We stood in a line leading into the building for, I think, 2 hours, and as we were getting close to the front of the line, some guards in uniform marched briskly right up to us and were wagging their fingers and speaking in rapid-fire Italian. They put on a really great show at being quite indignant and offended. It seems that my wife was about to break a cardinal rule, a dress code violation, because the shirt top that she was wearing was short-sleeved, so you could see her shoulders. Apparently that was disgraceful for the Vatican Museum guards. Well, we were not about to go back to the hotel to get her a different shirt because then we'd be starting again at the back of the line, which had already taken us an hour or two to get through and was only longer now. Fortunately, I had brought my khaki shorts to wear later in the day when things got too hot. So I draped my shorts around her shoulders, the guards retreated, and led us into the building. We opened the doors, stepped inside a long hallway full of statues, and I kid you not, all of those statues were nude. There were breasts and penises and you name it all along that hallway. Apparently anything goes if they're made of stone, but a pair of shoulders made of living flesh is just a bit too much for those Italians.
Yeah, that's a great story, Luke. Yeah, well, I guess that's what we're going to get into today. Just almost obsession that religions of all flavors have with this issue of human sexuality.
Now, whether it's the Vatican in Italy or evangelicals in Florida, everyone knows that Christianity has a very strained, even toxic relationship with sex. But as you just said, Scott, is it really just Christianity? If I'm not mistaken, every religion you could care to name either has prohibitive rules about sexual norms, things that adherents should not do or should do at the risk of being ostracized or even killed, and religious leaders must remain pure. I mean, there's that whole celibacy thing. Or in a few cases, there are cults that actually incorporate sex itself into their acts of worship. So it seems to me, as a general rule, that religions across the board are obsessed about sex. And that's what we'll be talking about in this episode and a few more which will follow over the next few weeks. But let me be absolutely clear about what we're not talking about. We are not going to get into the areas that are otherwise referred to as sexual ethics or sexual normativity. Whether, for example, same-sex attraction or transgenderism or masturbation or pornography, for example, whether any of these are wrong or not. Instead, the central question is going to be, why do religions care so much about sex? And since their answer usually involves pointing to certain writings that they view as sacred and divinely inspired, perhaps the central question could be restated, why does God care so much about sex? Who knows? There might be a good reason. I'd like to find that out. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, I think. It is something that isn't very often explored. We hear a lot of conversation about sexual ethics. Religions have a lot to say about, sexual norms and sexual ethics and so on, but we don't ever pull back from that and talk about just overall, why does it matter? Why is it such a part of the conversation in the first place? And that's what we're going to explore. So I think it's great.
Now, in addition to saying what we are and are not going to talk about, I also think it's important to emphasize who we are or are not talking to. we are not targeting any specific group or subgroup of people who practice sex, which, let's face it, basically that's everyone on the planet, even if you play with yourself. Instead, we are targeting religion, that religious streak in humans. Why is that cognitive trait so tightly wound up with the physical function of sex and the physical concept of gender and turning that into some kind of a spiritual act or power or property? And as always, as we like to do, we'll look at this from numerous angles. Next week, we'll talk to an expert who's a scholar with expertise in Judaism and Christianity, and he'll talk about religions in general from an academic point of view. He also has a deep personal connection to Judaism. He grew up in a Jewish household, though he's not a practicing Jew now. And so we'll have some additional questions for him about what ancient Judaism in particular has to say about this. The reason being, given that much of Christian thinking on this topic is built upon Jewish thinking. Their arguments often involve citing passages from what they call the Old Testament. And the 2 episodes after that will have us talking to scholars from the Christian or even evangelical point of view. One who studied closely the evangelical purity culture that sprang up a few decades ago, and the other from a scholar in Oxford. But this week, we'll be looking at the question or topic from a scientific point of view. Science has nothing to say about sexual ethics and morality, but it can give us a detailed picture of what sex looks like, who's doing what, and more importantly, where sex itself came from, and where our thinking about sex comes from. Most people see sex as a very physical, a bodily thing, but in fact, a lot of what sex is all about is going on inside of our heads. And so we thought it would be good to talk to a psychologist about this. And so we brought in Dr. Jordan Moon. Jordan, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
And thanks for taking up the invitation. By way of introduction, let me just say Jordan has done his PhD in social psychology at Arizona State University. He's now a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. Much of his research is focused around how people interact with cultural systems such as religion and morality in ways that advance their interests or allow them to mitigate threats, and how this results in differences across cultures. You're currently doing a research that's funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation.
Yeah.
And then what caught our eye towards your work, I was just doing some searches for why are religions so concerned about sex. Turns out you wrote a paper with the title, Why Are World Religions So Concerned with Sexual Behavior? So you were naturally the best expert for this topic.
It sounds like I gave it the right title then.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What drew you to the topic for what interested you in this area?
A few things. So first off, I was raised Mormon.
Oh,
so that piqued my interest in religion initially. As far as studying it from this perspective, I kind of never had any intuitions about, sexuality and religion or anything like that. But things like seeing preachers on campus, I would often see these people holding these big signs. And a lot of the evolutionary approaches to religion that I see are, all about religion's about cooperation, keeping people from cheating and things like that. But then isn't it weird that all the people carrying these big signs are saying, these people are going to hell, masturbators, fornicators, adulterers, and all these things almost all of these things are related to sex rather than to necessarily cooperation. And even the ones that are not actually about sex are sort of related to sex. I think, people perceive, drug users as being sexually promiscuous and things like that. And so, yeah, I always thought it was strange that was the kind of thing that they're focusing on rather than, scammers or people who are, inconsiderate drivers or things like that.
What kind of psychological framework are you coming from? Like, is it a particular school, a particular type of psychology that you're working from?
Yeah, I take evolutionary perspective. So
Okay.
essentially, and I mean, trying to integrate things from biology and cultural evolution and things like that, but trying to understand, just like you said in the introduction, not trying to understand what's right or what's wrong, but just trying to understand why things are the way that they are. And often, even a lot of the unsavory aspects of culture and the things that we don't like, they're there for a reason. I mean, plants have toxins for reasons, and we get diseases for reasons. And just by understanding those reasons doesn't mean that the toxins or the diseases are good themselves, right?
Right. Okay.
And Jordan, despite your Mormon background, and by the way, you're not still a practicing Mormon, I gather.
No.
No, okay. So despite your Mormon background, In preparing for writing your paper and the work that you're doing in this area, were you looking at any sacred writings of any kind, or was this all just purely from a scientific point of view?
No, yeah, just from a scientific point of view. So,
Right.
so reading some books about sexuality across world religions. There's a really interesting book called The Social Ecology of Religion that kind of describes a lot of these processes in many world religions, both big and small, and talks about how religions basically often kind of guide people through their lifespan, puberty kinds of rituals, and what
Right.
makes you a man or a woman, who can get married with whom, who can get divorced, or whether you can get divorced, abortion or birth control, and like you said in the introduction, all religions basically have things to say about these kinds of things, and
Right.
of course they're different. And I think Christianity is a little bit unique in how they approach it sometimes.
Okay.
The sort of really extreme, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas view of sexual pleasure being sort of inherently bad and only necessary if we want to reproduce. I think
Right.
that's sort of unique to Christianity. But if you think account for the broader phenomenon of religions caring about how people structure their lives and how people bring new people into the world, that is, I think, a universal across religions.
Right. Yeah. And we're going to look at that.
Well, I would think, yeah. I mean, once you have the birth of kind of civilization, right? Once people start to use agriculture and so on and live together, it would seem to me that sexuality starts to play a big role, right? Because of the social aspect of it, right? And the fact that something like infidelity can cause all kinds of issues within the tribe, jealousy and all that kind of stuff. It's fundamental to our humanity. So to me, it's not surprising anyway that it would play such a central role.
Yeah, you're right. And I think so. We often frame these kinds of issues as, why would anyone care what other people do? And maybe from a normative perspective, I mean, that's maybe what I like to think myself. But from a scientific perspective, it does kind of make sense that people are concerned about other people's behavior in this domain. If I'm married and I am worried about my wife cheating on me, of course, it makes sense for me to say, well, you're going to go to hell if you cheat.
Right.
Because that would help source my interest, right?
Right.
I do think some of the other phenomena are a little tougher to think about in that perspective. I mean, masturbation, for example.
Right.
But I think there's some really interesting recent work suggesting that maybe that's about self-control. People kind of perceive things like masturbation as being inconsistent, or as reducing people's ability to control themselves in other maybe cooperative domains.
Right.
Right.
Well, we're going to have to remember to ask our theologians about that when we talk to them in a couple of weeks. But today we're going to stick with the science.
Yep.
We're going to approach this from a scientific point of view. And Scott, maybe the first thing that we need to do is explain to people how mommies and daddies make babies. Do you want to take care of that, Scott? Okay.
I'll leave that. I'll leave that topic
Okay.
to others.
Okay. So joking aside, I did want to spend a couple of minutes about the biology of sex, but not that biology. Instead, where sex and gender come from, the evolution of sex and gender. But it turns out I couldn't find an expert on this topic. Science doesn't know, because the whole origin of sex and gender, it long precedes when animals diverged from plants. It goes back to even before single cell life. There's no fossils that'll give us any insight. We're not going to get anything from our genes on this question. So we can't get an expert to talk about that. But maybe the three of us can just talk generally about this from a scientific point of view. We can make guesses about the evolutionary advantage, the fact that it would seem natural that the advantage would be to generate genetic diversity. But that can't be the whole story, because we know of life forms still around today that go back and forth between sexual and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction being simply you just divide yourself down the middle and now you've got a clone of yourself, and rinse and repeat, as it were. And again, we can still see that happening in certain life forms today that have already figured out how to do it in the usual sexual way. So there's no clear, huge evolutionary advantage to sex. Otherwise, why would they hang on to that? Any thoughts on that, either of you?
No, I mean, I was just gonna say, there obviously must be a really huge advantage, right? Because you're foregoing replicating your entire genome to contributing half of your genes to the offspring. So, I mean, for something to evolve over that hurdle, I think it's quite remarkable.
Right.
It is, yeah. Is it less efficient? Like, is asexual reproduction not more efficient, like at a physical level, than sexual reproduction?
I don't know about the word efficient.
Like
What it is,
energy wise, I guess I'm thinking.
well, yeah, certainly, yeah, because there's a lot fewer cellular steps to be taken, all the different processes. So in that sense, it would be more efficient. And I guess one of the drawbacks of asexual reproduction is that you always get exactly the same in the progeny. And so if there ever is a stress, you wouldn't be solving problems from a genetic point of view. You wouldn't be helping the animal become more adapted to changes in the environment. So that would be the drawback of the asexual reproduction. But the fact is, these bugs, some of the bugs will still do it. They still keep
Yeah,
that ability. So don't know why. Another thought that occurred to me, this whole aspect, it's a theological concept that we sometimes have talked about before, this thing called intelligent design, which looks at the complexity and diversity of life and attributes all of that to some kind of a designer. And intelligence has somehow intervened and manipulated the laws of physics and biology to produce what we see around us and design that. And where I'm going with this is where sex and gender come from. Some people will say that, sex is a gift from God. We'll talk again a little bit more later on today, but that's why I'm bringing it up now. One of the mistakes that advocates of ID, intelligent design, keep making is attributing evidence of functionality for evidence of design. So, as an analogy to illustrate what I'm getting at here, imagine you're buying a house, you're in the market to buy a house, and you find a house that had been designed by an innovative architect or remodeled by a really ingenious do-it-yourselfer. And in this house you're considering buying, there's an old telephone that's being used to hold close the screen door to the backyard. The phone is just put on the floor by the door to keep it, it's kind of like a doorstop so that the wind doesn't keep opening the door. And you might also notice that an old drain pipe from the upstairs goes down to the basement, projects down below the ceiling in the basement. And on that pipe, the people are now hanging winter clothes and skates and things. Now, in both of those cases, the phone holding the screen door closed and that drain pipe used to hang clothes, they serve a purpose very well. They've got great functionality, but no one is going to call those examples of excellent design. In fact, if you were told that the architect specifically designed the house with those features, you really wouldn't say much about the credentials of these designers. So here, when it comes to humans and sex, and again, I'm addressing the question, was it designed? Is it a gift from God, as some people would like to say? Getting back to the analogy of the house with the telephone doorstop and the drain pipe holding up clothes, imagine this is a new house with an innovative, groundbreaking design. The architect has created a new kind of bathroom or bathroom/kitchen that has this strange thing in the wall where you set the lever this way and it becomes a sewer system connected to the toilet, and you flip the lever the other way and now it becomes the door to the oven that you can put in dough, and out pops the muffins and the loaf of bread. So I don't know about you guys, but I think this really raises serious questions about a designer designing this function in the way that we now have it.
George Carlin, has a whole joke about that. He says, if we're designed in that sense you're talking about, why would God put a sewer right through the middle of a playground?
Yeah, exactly.
It seems from the evidence that we see that there's a lot of repurposing, right?
Exactly.
In evolution, where something that wasn't intended for something, evolution will discover a use for it and kind of repurpose it. It's that seems to be a lot more what's going on than specifically somebody starting out with a blueprint and saying this is the best way to do. I agree. I think this is a major flaw with the ID approach.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with this. I do see this as being very typical of evolution to do this kind of a thing. You had simple cell life forms that first had to develop a tube system for food, and of course that means you have to get rid of the waste. And that was a whole feat of engineering in its own right. A lot of cellular steps, a lot of genes that are involved in producing this animal that now has a tube for food and waste. A lot of engineering went into that, millions of years worth of engineering. And now you want to have another system that involves somehow transferring genetic information. You could come up with a whole new tubular system, other tubes and pistons, as it were. Or you take the evolutionary approach, you just take an existing system and, like I said in my earlier example, you just put in a lever that switches it one way or the other between the two. So that's all to answer that question. Where does sex and gender come from? I think this is very much an evolutionary adaptation. We're still trying to understand the actual advantages of the whole thing. And clearly one advantage would be increasing genetic diversity. But to get closer to Jordan's area of expertise, Jordan, you're a social psychologist. You've done a lot of studying and thinking about the sociology underlying religion, or at least religious views. And as I said earlier, you wrote this paper on this interest, I'm going to call it, that religions have around the subject of sex. And so my first question to you then, Jordan, would be how widespread is this? Is it just some Christians or all Christians? Is it just Christianity or other religions that show this interest? Is it religions today, or does it also go back thousands or tens of thousands of years?
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned earlier, I think this is a very broad phenomenon. So maybe when we think, being obsessed about sex, we're probably thinking about, policing people's shoulders or skirts, or
Right.
saying that sexual pleasure is a bad thing that we must tolerate, unfortunately, if we want to have kids. So I think those are sort of Christian things. But I do think the broader phenomenon of figuring out when or regulating when and how people can get married and to whom, and whether they can get divorces, whether they can get abortions, whether you can use contraceptives. I mean, those are things that I think all religions deal with, and all of them, not all of them deal with all of them, and they do them in different degrees.
Right.
But yeah, I would say that's something fairly probably universal, and I would say those concerns are probably universal throughout time as well. I mean, like we were talking, anytime you're living in a society, you're interested in the behavior of other people because you have usually some stake in their outcomes, right?
Yeah, I like the word you use, stake, there, because that's what I often think about is why are we, quote, obsessed with sex? And not just in religion, but in our culture too. Let's face it, our culture is, you could say, is obsessed with sex as well, just in a very different way. But I think it's because a big part of it, the stakes are very high with sex. The psychosocial stakes, the actual practical reproductive stakes. Women, they get pregnant and so on, all the repercussions that has. I mean, it really does have a huge impact. So, yeah, again, not so surprising that it would be a major emphasis in our culture, in any culture, I think.
I think it has to be something more than just that the stakes are high, because religions, I'm speaking generally across the board, religions will have rules about various aspects of human being, human existence that have high stakes. So, for example, technology. Some religions, I'm thinking the Amish, for example, they're really against technology of any kind. Got the Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse transfusions, and the evangelicals who refuse vaccines. And there will be other laws, for example, on what we eat or drink or shouldn't eat or drink. And of course, we think naturally of the Jews and Muslims who won't eat pork, and evangelicals who won't have alcohol. And Jordan, you're a Mormon. I understand coffee's a no-no.
Yeah, coffee and tea and alcohol and other recreational drugs. Yeah.
Right. But Hindus and Buddhists, as far as I know, don't have any taboos around they don't have, certainly not around technology, and they don't have any taboos around what you eat or drink. Poverty.
Well, except in one sense, they're Hindus are they won't eat a cow, right?
Okay.
So,
well, that's true.
So
well,
so
but that makes the point too, that they say you can't eat a cow, but no other religions say that, right? This is where I'm going with this. You have all these religions that have some rules about this and some rules about that, but they all have rules about sex.
Yeah.
So, and those other examples were things that also have high stakes. So there's something about sex that really drives religious people.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're right. It is more than just the quote, the stakes. Yeah, for sure. Sex is such a, well, you talked about the physicality, right? And the fact that in a sexual act, you're opening yourself up to another person in the most intimate possible way. And that's going to have, I think, a very deep psychological effect on people, right?
Yeah, definitely. I guess I don't tend to think about it from that side. I'm thinking more of it as from this kind of functionalist perspective.
Right. Okay.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're thinking kind of on the individual well-being side. And I guess my perspective on, religion and well-being is, often, religion is associated with well-being positively, but there can be things about religion that are kind of not good, maybe not good toward women, for example. But from this evolutionary perspective, if if the religion's still creating, generating new members and spreading, then it's sort of a successful gene for the religion to have, as it were.
Right.
We're going to get into that point because I'm going to ask, well, if we're going to attribute it to simply this being a tool evolution uses to get more people out there, then I'm going to ask you, so why not then polygamy? But let's get to that later.
Yeah.
If we're going to attribute this to an evolutionary advantage, basically say that sex and gender are solely rooted, the origin of sex and gender are solely rooted in evolutionary mechanisms, I think we need to be very, very specific in what we mean by that. So this is something that precedes humans diverging from the apes. I already said that earlier. But the fact is, from my non-expert point of view, this phenotype of developing prohibitions around sex is a uniquely human thing. Other animals don't have this prohibition. They don't have these taboos. This is another example of human exceptionalism, which, again, ID people are really big on human exceptionalism. Well, now you need to add this to the list as well. I'm not aware of any taboos that animals have around sex. They don't have any kind of punishments for sexual deviants, in air quotes, or sexual addicts. They're not shy about engaging in sex out in the open. And, public nudity, we've got rules against public nudity for people, but these animals, none of them are carrying fig leaves or doing anything. So this is a uniquely human thing. And it's interesting that somehow came up in evolution. I don't know if you, Jordan, had any thoughts about that?
Well, I would say animals are also doing things to, control reproductive outcomes. I mean, and yeah, it's not through norms like humans have, but I mean, infanticide, or there's a lot of, I think, lions and some apes will kill offspring of someone else if it means the female is going to be ready to mate again sooner, or things like that.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, I think norms in this sense are certainly a unique human thing, a uniquely human thing.
It seems like the more advanced in evolutionary terms, the more advanced an animal is, the more sophisticated those strategies become, in a sense, right? Like, you do have communities of apes and things like that who do have a whole social hierarchy, a whole social order, and sex is part of that. Who they can have sex with and attracting mates, and things like that. No, it's not the same as humans, but I can see a pathway there, right? How once you have beings that are self-conscious and self-aware, that just gets heightened more and more. Well, that's my take.
Again, maybe I'm belaboring the point. It's taken to a whole new level for humans. So, for example, yes, Jordan, you just mentioned there's a couple ideas that I hadn't heard of where the apes might commit infanticide, either to control their numbers, but then also to encourage the female to be in a reproductive readiness state. But they don't have any rules whatsoever of, for example, playing with yourself or having homosexual tendencies. There's no outcasting of the members who want to engage in those kinds of things, let alone, as I said earlier, the nudity. So humans have taken this to a whole new level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the question then that we hope to come to at some point, not just today with Jordan, but also with our theologians, finding out why this is. Okay, so let's leave this point because there's just so much we want to talk about. One of the things that I do want to emphasize as we talk about this is we need to distinguish between Christianity and Puritanism. A lot of people conflate the two. They'll talk about, things that we don't do because of Christian teachings, but a lot of it does come back to Puritanism. Victorian England developed all kinds of strange hang-ups around all kinds of things, skirt lengths and public displays of affection, but they also got into how you need to pour your tea, whether you pour the milk into the tea or the tea into the milk, and how you lift the cup up, with your finger extended and all. Those are all Victorian English norms. That's what we call Puritanism, and it's a cultural thing. It's rooted in all kinds of societal values other than religion, although I'm sure Christianity did influence it, but it does come from other cultural factors. I don't know, Scott, you're nodding. Do you know anything about these Victorian standards?
Well, yeah. Well, the Victorian era has fascinated me for many years, so I have spent a lot of time reading about it and also reading the literature of Victorians. It's a very paradoxical time because on the one hand, there is that kind of, puritanical streak. On the other hand, it's the Victorians that gave birth to Darwin and Freud, and and so there is another side there that They're not maybe as quote Victorian as people sometimes make out. The word Puritan is itself problematic in a lot of ways, because what are you talking about, right? Like the Puritan movement of the 17th century in the United States and Britain, that's a very different thing. And in fact, interestingly enough, they were very sexually positive because they were reacting to Catholicism. And Catholicism, of course, had the celibacy of priests and things like that. And in reaction to that, there was a man prosecuted in New England for refusing to have sex with his wife. The wife went and complained to the elders of the church. Not kidding. The elders of the church, and the elders brought this man up and they tried him because he was withholding himself. So that's not typically what you think of as Puritans, right? But the term in its general usage, yes. And certainly the Victorians did have that puritanical streak. So you're absolutely right.
Does the term puritanical come from the word purity?
No, not really. It comes more from the word Puritan, and that word really is nothing to do with sexuality or anything like that. That was the idea. There was pure religion, right? That the Puritans were those who left the Church of England because they believed it had become impure theologically, not sexually.
Okay.
But unfortunately, that all got distorted when later writers reacting to it and so on. So anyway, we'll leave that off. But just a little clarification.
All right. So we've done a lot of circling around the topic, from a general point of view. But I think now, Jordan, we want to get your expertise on this. There probably isn't a physical explanation, a biological reason for this concern that religion has around sex. Instead, this aversion or caution around sex is purely in the head. It's a cognitive or psychological explanation. And Jordan, you're a psychologist, a social psychologist. So you wrote a paper on this. Why don't you get us started on your paper, what it shows, and we'll start to ask questions once you put that on the table.
Yeah, sure. So I guess in trying to answer why are world religions concerned about sexual behavior, I think you can look at it at a few different levels. So the first level that I'll talk about that I introduce in the paper is, of course, the individual level. And I think a lot of people have this idea that religions are kind of arbitrarily instilling these, prudish, puritanical, we could say, norms in people, and kind of for no good reason. It's just making people unnecessarily feel guilt and shame and, things because they're not living up to what they should. And so I think that's a very common view of religion from outsiders. And so Jason Whedon and a couple of other people came up with what they call the reproductive religiosity model. And this is what really kind of got me thinking about these issues in this way. And so basically what they did is they have these big data sets and they correlate religious variables with some other variables, the kinds of variables that everyone knows by now are correlated with religion, certain kinds of personality variables. Religious people are less open to experience, if you use the big five taxonomy, for example, or age, older people tend to be more religious, or gender, women tend to be more religious, or even things like morality type variables or cooperation type variables. So some people have taken the World Values Survey. There's these items about how justifiable do you think it is to not pay fare on public transport or to cheat on your taxes, and religious people say these are less justifiable than non-religious people, and so a lot of people have made their careers out of pointing out all of these correlates of religious variables and saying, look, this suggests that religious people are more cooperative. Like that's the function of religion, is cooperation. And so what Jason Whedon and his colleagues did is they did those same analyses and they said, yeah, look, we agree. If you just correlate religious variables with this, you get these correlations. But if you add to the model what I'll call sexual morality variables or reproductive morality variables, then it seems like the reproductive morality variables are the ones that predict the religious variables, and the other ones are kind of no longer predicting anything. I don't know how to explain this statistically, maybe for the science,
just so I can be clear on this, so you're saying that you'll take, for example, a personality variable like compassion, for example, And you'll say that compassion may correlate with religiosity. We would think it would, but you're saying actually attitudes towards sex correlate better with religion than compassion.
Yeah, better. And then if you have them sort of in the same model, I mean, if you do partial correlations, for example, or multiple regression where you have compassion and belief that sex before marriage is immoral, if you have those two variables predicting religiosity, then it'll be the sexual morality variable that seems to explain it. And the other one will probably not be very often. Very many of these variables are kind of no longer significant once you account for these other, the sexual morality variables.
Wow.
And so what that suggests, and what they say, is religion is really sort of more about these things, and maybe a lot of the things that correlate with religious variables only correlate with religious variables because they correlate with the sexual morality variables, So in their perspective, people who don't like sex before marriage are probably less likely to, go out drinking often. And, that's why not going out drinking often is correlated with religiosity, for example. I mean, potentially.
Right. How do you draw those, I guess, causal connections? Like, for example, I just think like the chicken and egg problem, right? So could you also flip that and say that religion causes the sexual? You know what I'm saying? How do you know which is causing which?
Yeah, so you can't do that with the correlational studies I just mentioned. And the way those models are built are predicting religion rather than letting religion predict these things.
Right.
But there's also some longitudinal data. So, for example, kids in college who are especially motivated to explore their sexuality tend to become a little less religious, and then might become more religious later in life. People tend to become more religious after they have kids. But maybe once those kids have left the house, you might become a little bit less religious. So there's some longitudinal work that I think gives an okay estimate that this is kind of a causal arrow. Although, I mean, I don't want to discount that religions also cause people to have certain attitudes, because that certainly also happens, right?
Right.
And religious reminders, there's some interesting experiments on this, reminding people of religious concepts can enhance their moral judgments, but especially moral judgments about sexual type things.
Just for our listeners, maybe, and for me, because I'm not a statistician. What's a longitudinal study? Well, how do you define that?
Yeah, that would be following people across time. And so,
okay.
So a bunch of points across time for a single person,
right.
And that lets you know, is it an increase in this thing that causes this thing, or is it the opposite way? Is it religion that's causing the sexual attitudes, or is it sexual attitudes that are causing preceding shifts in religion? Yeah.
Yes.
One of the points you were making a moment ago, Jordan, was that you're talking here about correlational studies, how things seem to vary together, but that doesn't predict causality. You can't, just by simply showing that they're correlated, doesn't mean that one causes the other. But I did think that your paper, I was reading essentially a review of it, or more of a summary of it, presenting it to a more general audience. And in that, they were saying essentially that rather than the usual view that people have, which is that religion is in the driver's seat and it's forcing conservative attitudes about sex for control purposes, instead of that, it was the other way around, that people who already have those conservative values, they already have them, and then now they're using religion to justify their views.
Yeah. So I would say the correlational studies are suggestive of that, but not conclusive.
Right.
And the longitudinal studies are a little bit better at that.
So in other words, we've had the cart before the horse the whole time.
Yeah, exactly. So that's I would say the individual level, level of analysis. So maybe people are attracted to religion in part because it aligns with their goals, and those goals can be a lot of things. They can be affiliating with friends and or family that's part of the religion, but they can also, I think, be these reproductive goals or sexual goals. So one assumption of this idea is that people have some sort of intuition about the implications of different kinds of, I guess, cultural systems or belief systems for their goals, and and they obviously prefer the kinds of systems that are going to help them advance their goals. So a lot of cognitive science of religion has focused on how appealing certain ideas can be. So, certain beliefs or ideas about God might be especially easy to remember. Maybe you've encountered, minimal counterintuitiveness or concepts like that. Yeah, so a lot of this literature thinks about how appealing are ideas. And I think one thing that's been maybe underrepresented in that field is how ideas can be more or less appealing depending on our own goals. So,
Right.
so I'll give you an example. So in my previous life as a Mormon missionary, and I think everyone's intuition is you want to make people have really spiritual emotions, spiritual experiences, and that's what's going to convert them. And sure, that probably does, right? I won't dispute that. But I think it's much easier to give someone or encourage someone to have one of those experiences if they have, I don't know, a friend or a family member in the congregation, right? Or I mean, if you want to convert a young man, for example, a lot of young men really don't care at all about religion, but if there's a girl at church, then suddenly, oh wow, now I'm willing to have these kinds of
Right.
spiritual things. And it's not that anything about the theology has become more plausible. It's just that their goals are now more compatible, and thus the religion seems a little bit more palatable.
Right.
So that then gets close to a question that I wanted to ask at some point. Maybe this is the time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the underlying assumptions that I got the sense when I was reading your paper, the assumption is that religious people, they're trying to control sexual behavior. And that's also what social psychologists such as you're trying to explain. What's the relationship between religion and sex? It is very much the assumption that this is all about reproduction. In both cases, the underlying assumption is that sex is about reproductive success. But for many other people, sexual activity is simply about enjoyment. It's not about reproductive success. It's about enjoyment, pleasuring, and expressing love. And we might want to talk about the extent to which religious people and social psychologists account for that. We can take the discussion a step further and ask if the main reason is to control or encourage reproduction, what about people who are otherwise naturally sterile? They're shown to be incapable of having children, or they might ask scientific medicine, to make them that way by getting some kind of a sterilization procedure or just using contraception. Or those people who choose to enjoy sexual pleasure completely or on their own without anyone else involved. One would think that those people should be free to enjoy themselves because there's little or no risk of having children. And yet religions don't recognize that. That's clearly not, it doesn't seem to be one of the reasons why they're all opposed to these things. It's not about enhancing reproductive success. They still have very much to say about masturbation. So
Yeah,
are we missing part of the story by not accounting for those?
yeah, that's a really good question. So there's some interesting work on, for example, opposition to gay marriage, and some people have, I think, found some interesting evidence that that's sort of also rooted in the stereotype that gay men, especially, are sexually promiscuous, and just like you said, why does anyone care, right? It's not affecting other people.
And just to emphasize then, we're not trying to justify this. We're trying to account for why does religion feel they have a say in this, or how are social psychologists trying to explain this? Is it about simply reproductive success, or is there something more to the story than that? So we're just looking at the origin of that interest that religion has in the matter. We're not trying to justify the morality one way or the other on that point.
Why do we?
But
Right.
Jordan, I cut you
Right.
off. You're in the middle of saying.
So I want to make the point that there's not always a match between what is evolved and like the outcome directly, right?
Okay.
So there doesn't have to be an innate drive to have kids, right? What you need is a drive to have sex, right? And so I think in this case, there doesn't need to be a mechanism that's sensitive to the context necessarily about whether or not there could be children involved, but it could be about stomping out promiscuity just in general, right? Does that make sense?
Why would religion need to stomp out promiscuity? especially if the point why we have this evolved mechanism and attention towards sex because we want to increase reproductive success, why then would you want to stomp out promiscuity?
Yeah, well, you want to stomp out certain types of sexual activity, right? So, I mean, I think most religions are fine with married couples having sex, and that's all fine and dandy.
But I'll interject then. Again, if the interest in religion is for couples to make children because they want more religious children, then why would they be wanting to control it as opposed to encouraging it, right? Like, I'm not advocating that everyone go and do whatever they want. That's not my point. I'm trying to understand what's the driving force behind this interest that religion has over all aspects of sexuality. And if that interest, the reason for them being that way, is because they're trying to enhance reproductive success, then why are all these controls in place to limit reproductive success?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that they're limiting reproductive success. I would say they are making reproduction more efficient or maybe safer in some ways.
Safer in the sense of STDs, for example? Is that what you're getting at?
No, safer in this. Well, so I guess not sex safer necessarily, but I guess I was going down.
So rather creating a great environment for raising kids is what you're getting at. The mental health, the
Yeah,
psychological health of the children.
yeah. Well, I mean, again, I don't think about religion as having any motive. I mean, I'm thinking about individuals and why would they want to be part of a religion? Why would they advocate for these kinds of religious norms?
Okay.
And so if you're in a committed relationship, the best outcome for you is for other people to also be in committed relationships and for there to be norms against cheating on your partner or things like that, because you only stand to lose if those norms are loosened or changed, right?
Right.
So I'll give you an example of a really interesting study that kind of gets at this. So there's a group called the Dogon in West Mali. So some anthropologists went in and they did this study with them. And part of their indigenous religion is they have menstrual huts. When women are menstruating, they put them in these menstrual huts. They're really apparently very uncomfortable. And there are religious norms encouraging the women to stay in these menstrual huts. I think there's the threat of supernatural punishment if they don't obey. And there's also, I think, some kind of maybe livestock fee they have to pay if they're caught being dishonest about this. And so they're in these menstrual huts, and then after they get out of these menstrual huts, the husband and the husband's family are really, really vigilant, keeping an eye on these women. And so it turns out that if you actually look at their DNA, the men who practice this religion are less likely than men who are Christian or Muslim in this population to unknowingly father the children of someone else. Right, so cuckoldry, be cuckolded against essentially to father someone else's children unknowingly.
Less likely than the Christians of that same society.
The Christians and the Muslims in that society, yeah, and so that seems like a religious ritual that's sort of specifically tailored for maybe even for that group's social ecology in order to basically to benefit men. The men in that society, but that's a very real evolutionary advantage.
Well, that's maybe I'm a little bit unclear on that. So that certainly benefits not just the men, but individual men. That means that any given individual man knows that the kids he's raising are his kids, they're my kids, that kind of thing. Whereas I would have thought maybe there was an evolutionary advantage for the whole tribe to be raising children, and it doesn't really matter who's the father. You'd want the more competitive father to be the father. But whether everybody's raising the children of some other man who is most evolutionarily fit, they're raising the best evolutionarily fit children. And we have this saying, it takes a village to raise a child, or something to that effect. It takes the village. And I would have thought that evolutionary success would be enhanced if you built in a way of thinking. Let's use the word religion, a religion that favors the village gathering around the reproducing couples, all of them collectively, and raising the children collectively, rather than building in religions that protect the individual couples, each individual couple. And getting back to Jordan's point about the Dogon men, really what that religion is protecting is the individual man from making sure that he's raising his child. And I would have thought it'd be better, evolutionarily better, for this religion that basically brought the tribe together to raise the children collectively. What about that, Jordan?
Yeah, so what you're talking about sounds kind of like a group selection argument, which some people have made, which is very controversial in evolutionary biology. But I mean, so biologists tend to think of things at the individual level. Individuals are what reproduce, and so in your case, where if you had a society where they're just anyone's taking care of whoever, someone who defects from that or is a little extra selfish and goes and puts their own genes forward, I guess, or however you want to say, they're going to be better off. And so that kind of phenotype of that cheating person is actually going to do better, right?
But Jordan, somewhere in your paper, I was reading about the evolutionary or reproductive cost-benefit ratio for monogamy versus polygamy. I read that maybe it was in the paper that was reviewing yours. But is there anything you could say about the relative cost-benefit ratio for monogamy versus polygamy?
Maybe can you define what you mean by cost-benefit ratio? Do you mean for individuals or for...
Well, what you were saying a moment ago was that this evolutionary advantage was being exerted at the individual level. The man would know that it was his
Right.
child that was being raised as opposed to raising someone else's child. But
Mhm.
is it better to have a whole tribe gathering around even one reproducing alpha male? I guess this is what happens in ape packs or tribes, whatever they're called, where the whole tribe is gathered around the alpha male, and he's the one who has first access, let's just put it that way. And so you've got this whole tribe protecting the children. There's a huge benefit to that, and it's more efficient. You've got all these warriors protecting the one queen bee. Now I'm mixing my metaphors here, but you've got all these other individuals protecting the one reproducing individual, the queen bee or the alpha male gorilla. There's a lot of benefit there as opposed to all the cost for each of the individual reproducing couples, and especially the one man raising his child. That sounds very cost prohibitive.
So you're saying polygyny maybe seems more efficient?
Yeah, that's my question. And maybe to put this in a spiritual point of view, when we read the Old Testament, for example, a lot of the ancient patriarchs, they were polygamous, but eventually over time, they, as a nation, learned that monogamy was a better way to go. And I'm going to ask them why that was the case. But clearly, here you had people, this ancient Semitic people who were polygamous, or at least the more wealthy ones amongst them were, and eventually they transitioned towards a monogamous society. Why would they do that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So if you look at this, so there's a really interesting paper that I mentioned in my paper. I think maybe that's what you're thinking of. So most cultures historically throughout the world have been polygynous. I think it's something like 89% or something very high.
Mm.
I mean, that's in many ways seems like the default for cultures, but most of the world today, so that's percentage of number of cultures. But if you look at the most people today, monogamy is more common, right? And so that's kind of a weird puzzle. Where did that come from? Why did it spread so well?
So just so I can understand you clearly, and maybe the listener as well, most cultures, most of them would have been polygamous. So, for example, there's 3 billion Christians in the world, and they count for just one. Cultures, as opposed to the Dogon tribe, that there's only a dozen, but they also count for one. Did I make that any more clear?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, if you treat each culture as one unit, most cultures throughout history
A
have been
polygamist.
polygynous specifically. So multiple wives for one man.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the fact that monogamy is so common now is kind of an interesting puzzle. So Joe Henrich was the author of this. They have really interesting explanation, which is essentially the problem you have in polygynous cultures is there's a bunch of men who are left without partners. Mathematically, unless tons of men are dying, then you have a lot of men that are sort of without any prospects, right? And we've known for a long time that a lot of crime is committed by young unmated men, men who are sort of becoming really impulsive because they're gonna become rich and find a partner, or they're gonna just nothing's gonna happen for them. So they kind of become essentially, so these young men who have very few prospects are kind of a trouble in many societies. And so it seems like a good solution culturally to limit the amount of wives a man can have, so that, these men, instead of channeling their efforts towards being competitive and impulsive and doing things like that, that they can be, responsible citizens.
Another thing I read in your paper, Jordan, you referred to it as a celibacy puzzle. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of people hear about this kind of religion helps reproduction in certain ways, and they think about, well, why are there people who, priests or monks who are celibate?
Yeah.
And I think there's a few possibilities. So one of them is potentially the family or siblings of the celibate individual might be doing better. Maybe being a priest or a monk gives you some kind of status, and so maybe you don't have children yourself, but your nieces and nephews have better outcomes, right? So that could be one way of solving this problem. And there's actually some work that's come out since about Buddhist monks, and they looked at the outcomes of monks and their siblings. And so men who have brothers who become monks tend to have more kids, essentially. And so there's some kind of reproductive benefit for them. And so, of course, for the celibate brother, that's not a good trade-off at all, right? He's not having any children himself. But if the parents are able to choose, then it can make sense for the parents, because they're going to end up having more grandchildren if they send one of these sons off to the monastery. And they frame it as more about avoiding competition for resources. So they don't have to split their inheritance if they send one of their sons to the monastery.
So many factors.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Luke. So many factors. I guess that's one of the things I wonder about a little bit is the whole science of evolutionary psychology. How empirical is it? How hard a science is it compared to, physics? I always think of as kind of the hardest science, right? Like it's, physics is pretty solid. You do these biology maybe is next, and so on. But now you get up to this level, and you're dealing with thousands of variables and possibilities. How do you work that through? How do you handle that?
Yeah, that is a big question. Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, I think, for exactly that reason. I will say, so a lot of people have accused evolutionary psychology of being, just so stories.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess you've heard that. But I do think carefully done evolutionary psychology can come up with hypotheses. I mean,
Right.
To me, that's what
Right.
a just so story is it's a hypothesis. And, other people, I guess a normal non-evolutionary social psychologist will maybe just come up with hypotheses based on what they think about what other people think, or based on some other literature. And really the difference is evolutionary psychologists think about function in a more specific way, or think about the kinds of mechanisms that you would expect to have arisen historically, for challenges that people would have had. So I there's a lot that I think could be improved in evolutionary psychology, but I think when done well, it can generate
Insights.
really novel hypotheses.
Right.
And then we can test them, and we can't necessarily test. We can't go back in time and, do a longitudinal analysis about like, okay, this selection pressure led to this cognitive mechanism, but I think we can, we can support our hypotheses essentially.
So then this brings together two threads then, and I know I'm repeating something we were talking about roughly 20 minutes ago, but it brings together those same threads again. We're talking now about evolutionary mechanisms, explaining for this exorbitant attention on the part of religion towards sex. So evolution being behind it all. And we're also saying it's so complicated. There's so many variables. And yet this is all in human sexuality. We don't see this in the animals. They don't have all these taboos. They don't have all these rules. They have similar societies. I mean, I think we can make a good argument for similarities in the societies of a baboon colony, for example, or what have you. But all these taboos and all these rules and all these, monogamy versus polygamy and that sort of thing, how can that be evolutionarily based if it's only in humans? And we evolved, we diverged from the monkeys only a couple million years ago. I'm just curious, these two threads are coming back together again. If it's all evolution, then we should see some of this in our earlier ancestors or animals that come from those earlier ancestors.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a good question too. So I guess one way you can think about this is one thing that we have that other animals don't have is language, at least,
Hmm.
in not in the same way. So, I mean, if you think about two apes stealing each other's resources, if I steal your food, you can aggress against me, but that's really the only thing you can do. But since we have language, if I steal your food, Luke, you can tell Scott, and then my reputation is shot, right? And so I think, uh,
Okay.
yeah, so I think human culture is maybe relies a lot on language,
All right.
and
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Luke, when you were talking too, I was thinking, there's a great line in Genesis that could almost summarize a lot of what we're saying. And that line is, who told you you were naked? All of a sudden, these humans suddenly have shame. They have this idea of shame. Who told you that you were naked? I mean, that's a real fundamental.
Is fundamental. And Scott, that's a perfect segue. I wanted to make one last point, and I was thinking, how am I going to do this? And you use the word shame. That's where I want to go. Now, this isn't necessarily Jordan's area of expertise, but I'd be interested to see what Jordan has to think. And for that matter, you, Scott, you can weigh in. The one last point I wanted to get into, it's actually the reason why I want to do this miniseries. It's the aspect of sex is so fundamental to being human, and yet society and culture and religion have attached so much shame and guilt and condemnation all around these things. And that shame and guilt, it hits us deep at our core and is potentially, usually, very destructive. It affects how we relate to our family, to our friends, to our community, and, since this is a religious show, even to God. And here's another thing that makes it even worse. That shame and that guilt is not evenly applied. People across the board attach so much more importance to this when it comes to girls and daughters than they do to boys and sons. They'll say that the boys are just sowing their wild oats, but girls will have fundamentally debased themselves. And this is why I want to do this mini series. And any thoughts from either of you too around this whole concept of shame and guilt and condemnation that we attach so much to this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about guilt and shame and things like that, and how fundamental they are to, well, at least the Christian religion, but which I'm most familiar with, those are big factors, and it's kind of not a wonder in a way that the Bible starts with that question. Who told you you were naked? And it's absolutely right. Like, you think of the virgin, the whole idea of the virgin, right? It's very focused on women. Nobody cares if a guy's a virgin, right? But I mean, I shouldn't say they don't care, but they care a lot
Well,
less.
you're right. They usually don't
Yeah,
care. The boys are just sowing their wild
no,
oats, and okay, yeah,
that's right.
take a shower and you're back, you're normal
Yeah.
again. But
Yeah, they're seen as being more of a man
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing, right? But and maybe part of that, and this is where maybe Jordan could come in too, is maybe the risk factor is higher with women, right? They have a lot more to lose in the reproductive game, the men, especially historically. Nowadays, sure, you've got birth control and abortion pills and things like this. Women have a lot more control over their reproductive rights and all that, but in the past, they didn't. So, the whole virgin thing, I think, is a lot about men protecting their daughters from that risk and so on. So I don't know if that's a factor as well. Again, it's one of these things where there's just tons of variables.
And Scott, that's definitely a question that I want to talk to. For example, the expert we're going to bring in, that he's an expert on Judaism, and I would say
Right.
him in particular because again, we will talk to a scholar coming from the evangelical, from the Christian point of view. But a lot of the arguments
Yeah.
there are rooted in Judaistic
Right.
thinking, and so I want to
Right.
start with that scholar.
Yeah.
Anything from you, Jordan?
Yeah, well, I guess I was just gonna harken back to your mention of is versus ought in the
Right.
introduction, and understanding why things are, and of course it's terrible for mental health to have
Yeah,
things like
totally.
shame and guilt. It's really bad. But there's a reason why people feel shame and guilt. Because they're emotions that can prevent you from doing things that will get you devalued by your group. So I guess from that
Right.
perspective, yeah, I agree with you totally. It's really bad and unfortunate that religions have these outcomes,
Yeah.
but I guess it's important to understand where they come from.
And
Right.
so here's where I get all preachy, and I'm totally preaching to myself here too. We should be more ashamed and guilty and feel condemnation about how we stand on poverty, for example. and wealth inequality. And again, I'm speaking to myself. I mean, by global standards, I'm a very wealthy person. We should have a whole lot of shame and guilt and condemnation about how we stand on that, let alone a number of other issues. But why do we attach so much shame and guilt to this? That's why I want to get into this topic. So we are long over time. Jordan, is there anything that we didn't talk about in your paper, or for that matter, maybe you're working on a new study if you want to whet our appetite for something that you're looking at? Anything more from you?
You mentioned this grant that I'm working on. We're interested in religious fasting and human flourishing. Whether fasting improves, well-being, and if so, how?
Okay, Dr. Moon, we really do appreciate you coming in and sharing of your expertise on some things, but also some of your opinions. We were unfair to you. We were asking some questions that really, they're not your area of expertise, but you've been game, and it was great to talk to you about those general things, but then also your study. That was really good.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Jordan. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and so next week we are going to talk to someone who's an expert on the religious angle. We're going to talk to Dr. Evyatar Marienberg, an academic with expertise on Jewish and Christian thinking, but he's also got a personal connection to Judaism. He grew up in a Jewish household, so he'll also give us some important insight into Jewish thinking around sex. And that's important because, as I said already, much of Christian thinking is built upon Jewish thinking. Their arguments are often couched in language that they get from what they call the Old Testament and often quote passages from the Hebrew Bible. So make sure to join us again next week.